Well, evening all. Hope we're doing well. I've made the last couple of videos and I'm glad they've been well received about my early experience with the treatment of ADHD. As background, I was diagnosed with ADHD a few months ago now at the age of 32, and it's been an interesting experience since, not just treating the condition with medication and making some changes to my lifestyle to accommodate it, but actually looking back, realizing how much I'd already been doing to treat and manage and sometimes medicate this condition, particularly now that I realize that although recently diagnosed, it's actually something that I've been dealing with pretty much my entire life. So what I'd like to do probably for the next few videos, which I'll break into a bit of a series, is talk a bit more about some of the non-medication management tools that I have been knowingly or unknowingly using to manage my ADHD and the negative impacts thereof, not just since being diagnosed, but actually really over my whole, certainly adult life through teen years, 20s, and now my early 30s. I'm probably going to introduce a few different topics and ideas over this series, from little kind of habits and kind of micro routines, as we'll talk about today, to philosophies and ways of thinking, and some of the tools that I use there that I've found have been extremely beneficial in helping me not just manage the negative symptoms of ADHD, but actually live a reasonably fulfilled, successful and happy life. I won't say in spite of the condition, but with the condition. So for today, I'm going to make a start by talking about the importance of routines and some of the risks of routines when it comes to the ADHD mind. Because what I've come to realize looking back is that throughout certainly my 20s and 30s, I have needed and I've self-imposed a level of structure and routine and consistency, which is probably unusual for most, certainly neurotypical people going through that kind of age range. And it's led me to a realization that I've been reflecting on the last week or so, that the idea of routine is a bit of a double-edged sword when it comes to ADHD. On the one hand, a level of routine is probably more important for the ADHD mind than for just about any other mind in the world. Without routine, we're at much higher risk of both short and long-term negative impacts and a huge amount of anxiety, stress, depression and other psychiatric concerns that come with it. But then on the other side, the idea of routine as we typically understand it can be an absolute death knell for the ADHD mind. Like many of us, I think I've had and watched and consumed my fair share of the hashtag optimal morning routine videos, and I've put a lot of pressure on myself to try and optimize a kind of very set, daily, structured routine at different times in my life. And what I've come to realize is that those, optimal routines and the advice and the books that you read, they're not for everyone. And if, like me, you have ADHD, I think there's a reasonable chance that that advice probably isn't for you either. So what I've come to understand instead, and I think it was put beautifully by Russell Barkley in one of his seminars, who's someone that I would thoroughly recommend watching, is that rather than necessarily routine and outrageous levels of structure, what we need is scaffolding. This is the language that Russell Barkley used anyway, sort of artificial guardrails and guide ropes and nudges and cues and pointers in our environment that we live in every day that help us move forward to manage some of the stress and the indecision and the anxiety and the chaos of the ADHD mind, and help us navigate and mitigate the negative short and long-term impacts of this condition. So my version of that, through a lot of trial and error, and in many ways without realizing it, this is a condition I've dealt with my whole life after all, I've actually been building that kind of scaffolding in lots of subtle ways. And for today's purposes, I'm going to refer to that scaffolding as micro routines. So what is a micro routine? Look, I don't think has a set definition, although it's quite a common concept. For me, a micro routine implies looking at routine through not the lens of a full day or a week or a month or kind of a periodized time like that, but instead looking at the smallest possible unit of routine possible, trying to perfect and trying to improve on that, and then kind of being really flexible as to where you place that micro routine in your day, in your week, in your month, in whatever order you choose that enables you to execute. That means a few things. I think it means that micro routines are probably modular in their nature. They're meant to slot in anywhere. I also think it helps to think about those micro routines and make them progressive, to try and gamify them somewhat, and to try and base them around as limited a range of things as possible, focusing specifically on the things that are intrinsically valuable, meaningful, and worthwhile to us as individuals and to you as an individual. Those micro routines, as much as they should be productive and they should help us deal with the external demands of life, they should be focused on strengthening the self. So in practice, and I think I'll talk about this probably over a series of videos, I've built micro routines and tools and scaffolding around work, around training, around traveling, around housework, self-care, reading, writing, doing groceries, and even now starting to make videos like this. And I found the more that I've created space for these micro routines, the better my outcomes have been and the more peacefully I've been able to live. In the inverse, the more that I've tried to follow a very strict, kind of true daily, weekly macro routine, the more I've actually lost that quality of execution and ultimately success, happiness, and peace that goes with it. So, as I say, I think over the next few videos, I'll probably look at a few tools, tips, tricks, and hacks specifically, ranging from the use of lists and timers and charts to the use of tools like non-sleep deep rest protocols or yoga nidra, how I approach my training, how I approach health and nutrition, how I approach self-care, and hopefully in that series there'll be a few useful and practical ideas for people to consider as well. But I think for today, let me just go into a bit more depth about why I think routine in the adjective sense, in the traditional sense, is a problem for the ADHD mind. And then I'll share a bit more about why I think micro routines might be a better antidote. So, look, as a starting point, routines by their nature are consistent, repetitive, and they are desperately orderly. And so for me, the first problem with them is that, number one, they are too orderly for the ADHD mind. The ADHD mind is one that tends to favor chaos. It favors the extremes. It favors novelty. It favors sensation. That old expression that ADHD stands for a desperate hunt for dopamine, I think in many ways rings true. And when we look at routines that are extremely orderly and set, well, there's immediate friction with the ADHD mind in that case. So I think they're too orderly. I also think they create their own demand avoidance. And I think this is actually quite a big one. So we know that demand avoidance is a common experience for pretty much every human being, especially during our more rebellious years in our teens and early 20s. But it's a very commonly pronounced symptom in ADHD. Demand avoidance is that idea that the more we're told to do something, the less likely we are to want to do it. It creates immediate friction, resistance, and anxiety, such that we either don't do the thing, or if we do the thing, it's usually driven very hard by an external force like a firm deadline, for example. And then if we actually manage it, we don't get the satisfaction or peace of having completed a task. We just get a moment of relief and a drop in stress, at least momentarily, until the next external demand comes along. And this is the nature of routines in many ways as well. When we assign ourselves this perfect, optimal, forward-looking, structured and timed routine, we actually are creating some of that external demand for ourselves. We're self-inflicting demand avoidance pretty much straight away. For me, at least in my experience, the end result of that is that I could usually stick with a very structured routine for a couple of days or so, but the second that I didn't feel like doing it anymore because the motivation had dropped down, suddenly that was compounded by the fact that I'd created this external expectation for myself. Straight away, you then start slipping, at least I did. You start missing some of those elements that you planned and structured, and then a vicious cycle starts off. You start not complying, you start not succeeding with that routine. That further diminishes your motivation, further increases the level of anxiety, and ultimately prevents you from really succeeding, and certainly doing so in a happy way. So that's the second issue for me. They create too much, albeit self-inflicted, demand avoidance. The third main issue I see, and this is somewhat related as well, is that with routine, because they're repetitive by nature, there's not really enough novelty in them, in my view at least, for the ADHD mind. They don't satisfy, again, that desperate hunt for dopamine and for progression and for new things. There's nothing inherently satisfying about routine. And in my view, we need to be looking specifically at things that allow us to work towards something new, different, more difficult, progressed, and just leads us towards new stimuli, new ideas, and new abilities. And then the final issue I have with routines is they are not objectively, but subjectively, I think, to the ADHD mind, just a bit too long term. Routines by their nature, and certainly by the way that we tend to understand them and the way we think about them when we're given advice about routines, is that they are not immediately rewarding. And we know how important immediate reward and how difficult delayed gratification is for the ADHD mind. Routines committed to now, especially the hard, repetitive, maybe boring things, we execute those routines based on the promise of future reward, either a gain or the avoidance of pain. And to be honest, we might have the most virtuous intentions in the world, especially with an ADHD mind, but realistically, the longer away that outcome is and the less enticing it is in its nature, certainly for us, the less likely we are to actually execute in the day and on the day. There's little connection between the work that we do today in a structured routine and the thing that we're supposed to be motivated to go and achieve, which frankly we really aren't, particularly when there are more interesting things available to us in our immediate environment and rewards that are available much more short term. I think we're setting ourselves up for failure with routines in that way, and that for me is another reason that I consider it to be not just a problem in terms of execution, but certainly it's where we see the often unspoken but very real and proven out in the data fact that ADHD is difficult in the immediate sense for people, but it does create real long-term negative impacts for a great number of people suffering the condition. And so when we apply that long-term lens to what we're doing and don't focus on what we can do in the now, we don't really get the chance to remedy that. So that's why for me routines are a problem. They're too orderly, they create demand avoidance, there's not nearly enough novelty, and they're a little bit too long-term. And really it's for all these reasons that I like the idea of micro-routines. As I mentioned, the way I look at micro-routines first and foremost is that they are modular in their nature. We're not focused on what we can do over the course of a day and structuring that to perfection. We're focused instead in trying to break that routine down into the smallest component parts that we possibly can. We try and define those parts and focus on those parts based on what can be progressive, what can be gamified, and what can be strengthening of the self because they're intrinsically valuable. And then we just take the pressure off ourselves in terms of trying to fit and time and organize those things in a perfect way. A great example might be, you might have a micro routine around making your coffee, for example. You might have a micro routine around going to the gym. A micro routine might be a little bit longer, or a little bit larger, like your workflow if you're, say, working from home on a laptop, for example. But the important thing is that having broken up these little parts of a typical daily or weekly routine, we then focus on our presence in executing on those things, the quality with which we can do so, and we try and, I suppose, as far as it's possible, get better by virtue of the things that we're doing. So if I was to break those four parts down, I mentioned modularity already. Choose things which have, to a degree, a defined beginning and end. Choose things which you do not, where possible, have to fit at a certain time in your schedule. Now, if you have a class to go to or a regular appointment, for example, then that is going to be something set in your diary, fine. But everything else, try and be as flexible as you can, whether some days you go to the gym at 5 in the morning or 5 in the evening, whether some days you organize your washing and your ironing on a, I don't know, Monday morning one week, and then a Sunday afternoon, a Tuesday evening, in the dead of night another time. Don't let that matter. Just focus on improving the quality of execution of that particular, albeit mundane, task. I mentioned the word progressive as a second point because for me, micro routines are best when they are focused around things that allow us to get better over time, because that brings with it a certain level of novelty, of increasing complexity, that allows us to have that feeling of improvement over time, to focus on progression, not just the completion of a task for the sake of it. This is why I like trying to include micro routines, however small, around things like learning and reading, like training and exercise. But you can actually apply that lens of progression to just about any micro routine, no matter how mundane. I mean, take the example of cleaning the kitchen, for example. Look at that micro routine as one in itself. You've been modular about it. You're going to choose where it goes. Now focus in the moment about, hey, how quickly can I clean the kitchen? How well can I clean the kitchen? How much can I potentially even enjoy cleaning the kitchen with the right combination of music and reward, for example, at the end of having done so? So think about micro routines where possible as being progressive, and they're going to be intrinsically a lot more motivating. I think linked to that as well, gamification again is important. Through a similar lens, cleaning the kitchen as well or as fast as you possibly can is an example of gamification. Trying to work out how many repetitions of a random combination of exercises you can do in 30 minutes as part of your training routine will stop it feeling so damn routine and will give us something to aim for, because again, this is the ADHD mind, right? We love dopamine, we love achievement, we love satisfying our pursuit of especially short-term rewards. And so the idea of gamification, giving ourselves a bit of a scorecard, giving ourselves something to aim for outside of just the completion of the task, for me is a great way of approaching micro routines as well. And then the final point I mentioned about micro routines, in terms of the nature of them rather than the specific activities, is I would try and focus on things that are what I would call self-strengthening. This for me is a really important one, particularly for the ADHD mind. It's very, very common for those who have grown up with the condition. This is my experience, and I've seen it time and time again in the literature. To grow up not being particularly good at internal validation and very frequently seeking external validation. There's lots of reasons for that. One of the great statistics that I recall from the ADHD Chatter podcast was that when it comes to a lack of sense of self, when it comes to rejection sensitive dysphoria, for example, which is another common symptom that's pronounced in ADHD, part of the reason for that might be that because of the behavioral issues of ADHD, that kids growing up between, toddler age and 18 receive something like 20,000 more corrections and rejections over their youth than a neurotypical person does. When we have an ADHD mind and an ADHD experience, we look outside of our own mind, which can really challenge us, for a sign as to what to do and how to do it and when to do it and why to do it. People pleasing can be a result of that. Going down paths that you think will make other people happy might be part of that. But the fundamental part is we don't necessarily spend enough time focused on the things that are intrinsically valuable to us, and sometimes we don't know what those things are, sadly. The good news is, for me, when we talk in terms of micro routines, when we talk in terms of making them modular and taking the pressure off when and in what order we deliver, when we make them progressive and we gamify them, we already start solving that problem, because we start doing things that improve our sense of self our self-efficacy, our self-confidence, our sense of personal growth. But the need for these micro routines to be self-strengthening is an end in itself as well. So all I'm going to advise here is try to focus your life, your routines, your day-to-day around the things that are genuinely, intrinsically meaningful and valuable to you. Own those activities, own those micro routines. Make sure that they are for you and not for anyone else. Just because you saw it in a YouTube video, just because you read it in a book, just because all your friends are doing X, Y, and Z. I know this is like a dad's advice to a teenager. Maybe it's the advice I would have given myself. Don't worry about what everyone else is doing. Don't do it just because someone else told you to. Choose the things that are genuinely meaningful and impactful to you and do them for no one else but you. Those micro routines that make up your day-to-day life, allow them to strengthen the self. So that's it for today, guys. As I say, what I'm probably going to do is probably break down some recommended tools and tricks and techniques that at least worked for me over the next 5 videos or so. Those videos will probably range from very tactical advice, like how to use lists and timers and charts, all the way to the value of embracing a level of minimalism, the use of different cognitive, behavioral and philosophical tools in how you think about life as much as how you execute on it, all the way to training and nutrition and lifestyle factors as well. Again, I'll bring my own personal experience there, I'll bring some of the science, I'll bring some of the literature, and hopefully that's going to be an interesting watch for some of you guys out there as well. In the meantime, thank you as always for tuning in. I would love to hear everyone's thoughts on routine, number one, particularly with an ADHD mind. And if maybe based on my description, you've actually been focused on some of your own micro routines, I'd love to hear a bit about what those are, how they work for you, why they work for you, and maybe some that you've tried that haven't worked so well as well. So I look forward to the next conversation. In the meantime, look after yourselves, look after each other, and I'll see you on the next one.